Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Goldman. I'm a senior at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm studying political science, specifically American politics, with minors in creative writing and English. And I've been fascinated with politics, I'm sure most of you have, for quite some time now. So I've really tried to immerse myself in the political culture at Penn, and I do a lot of that through writing. And on the side, I'm also an avid Yankees fan, which might not go over too well with the crowd generally. But so I'll be speaking about an issue that I believe the millennial generation can really coalesce around that hasn't been talked about much prior to this event. So I believe that looking at the survey through the lining of the political subtext, it provides a really interesting framework upon which to analyze the Millennial Values Survey. And what immediately jumped out to me was the critical issues that the millennials rated as being the most important. The top two being jobs/unemployment and the ballooning federal deficit. And the deficit, especially to me, which was actually a point higher than education, was especially surprising because in the media we often hear about, and especially on my campus, for example, Occupy Wall Street and the concern with economic and income inequality, but yet that rated at 40%. So the deficit to me really led me to think, well, what's the causative link between the millennial concern and the underlying reasons for why the federal deficit is such a big issue? And in terms of addressing the deficit, the millennials seem pretty even-handed. So while 7 in 10 say that the poor are actually too reliant on government assistance programs, 7 in 10, which would maybe necessitate some form of spending cuts, 7 in 10 also support the Buffett rule, which would raise taxes on those making $1 million annually, which would obviously raise revenue. So the real question we're looking at is, what's the causative link between the concern for reducing the deficit and the millennial generation? And I think you can't talk about reducing the deficit without what I believe is a link, that is reforming entitlements. Entitlement spending at this point constitutes roughly 50% of the annual budget expenditures, and in the coming years it'll grow to 70% and so on and so forth until reform is adequately addressed. And so I believe that the millennial generation is concerned about the deficit due to pending entitlement reform for a few reasons. Number one, we'll be paying into, through payroll taxes, Social Security and Medicare for 40, 45, 50 years until we finally retire. And so, we obviously want to make sure that these programs are around for us, but it's not really about making sure we get our due. I view it more through the prism of making sure that we preserve these very important programs for us and our children and successors, so on and so forth. Because as we've seen since the 1930s with Social Security and the 1960s with Medicare, entitlement programs are really integral to American society, to taking care of the elderly, and with Medicaid, helping people reach into the middle class. So I think going forward, you often hear with entitlement reform, it's the third rail of politics. You can't touch it. Politicians can't touch it because voters won't vote for them. And they can't touch it because interest groups like the AARP will demonize the issue. They'll demagogue it. I don't know if anyone's seen the recent AARP commercial where they have 100 people marching saying, "Don't touch our Medicare." But I think for the millennial generation, it's the first and foremost rail of politics, and it's really necessary because if we don't address the deficit, but more specifically entitlement reform, which, as the Bowles-Simpson Commission attested to, needs to be addressed in order to, make sure that these programs are solvent from here on out. We really need to take a broad, even-handed approach to how to address these issues. Politically speaking, I think the millennial generation has the willpower to enact change, although, as it's always been said, the youngest generations have the toughest time mobilizing. But I think, I'm definitely proud to be part of a generation that seems to prioritize preserving and stabilizing these very important systems and institutions known as entitlements in Social Security and Medicare, because they are essential to America going forward. I think the political kabuki needs to be replaced with a serious conversation on what politicians can do on Capitol Hill to address the pending disaster we see with Social Security, especially Medicare. And I think, usually the kids in the room aren't meant to lecture the adults, but I think at this juncture, the adults, being the politicians, have really left us no choice. So, thank you.